As training camp approaches, we'll be reviewing several players' performances during the 2023 season and discussing how they could impact the Eagles in the 2024 season. Today, we'll be looking at Jalen Carter. So, Jalen Carter had one of the best rookie seasons from an interior defensive lineman in recent memory. Just take a look at some of these numbers. Of the top 100 rookies in snaps since 2019, he was third in pressure rate, first in pass rush win rate, and then he was first in two other metrics that I look at. So I call one the real pressure rate, where you take their total pressures and subtract out their unblocked pressures and also their cleanup pressures. So really, this is taking a look at who is actually winning on their own merit. His real pressure rate was first. I have my own sort of algorithm that factors in all of these together. His pass rush score was first in that metric as well. And then when you compare him to all the defensive tackles overall in 2023, his pressure rate was 16th, his pass rush win rate was 7th, his real pressure rate was 5th, and his pass rush score was 8th. That's insane numbers from a rookie, especially at the interior defensive line position where we've seen guys take a couple of seasons to really become that force that we see them playing at today. Like Quinnen Williams was not this level of player his rookie year. Neither was Jeffrey Simmons. It took Dexter Lawrence some time to get there as well. So Jalen Carter had a huge rookie year, and I don't think any of us are all that surprised. He was a blue chip prospect coming out. He is a blue chip player. And personally, I feel like the Eagles should be building their pass rush game plan around Jalen Carter, because this guy is going to be, in my eyes, one of the best defensive tackles in the league pretty quickly. What are your thoughts, Eric?
Yeah, absolutely. Now, when I first scouted Carter, I thought it's a pipe dream. There's no way that he would fall to the Eagles, but of course there was some of the off the field stuff that led to him dropping, because if that stuff didn't exist, he's probably up there in the top 3 for sure. And when I watched the tape, I legitimately thought this is the best defensive tackle prospect I've ever seen. Now, I wasn't scouting back when Aaron Donald came out of college, so that kind of predated when I was looking intimately at some of this film. But he just absolutely blew me away, so I was over the moon when they drafted him. Now, the one thing I discounted was he didn't have the full allotment of snaps that some other star defensive tackles would have in college. And you can only watch the highlights that are there. So until you look at the stats and you're like, oh, his snap count is a little bit lower than you'd expect for someone of his talent, you tend to maybe overrate what you saw a little bit, because if you're not asked to do it on 75% of the snaps, you can give a little more juice. That being said, what I saw in the snaps he did play was incredible. Now, last year I was thrilled with how he looked. Now, you made a terrific video about some of his struggles, so I'd love to have you kind of get into some of that for people who haven't seen your video of why he slowed down a little bit as it got into the year. But very successful rookie campaign, and I'm very excited to see what he'll do in a bigger role next year.
Yeah, so I think there's two ways we can kind of look at his slowdown, because he definitely did start out extremely hot at the beginning of his rookie season and then started to slow down as the schedule and the season went along. I think there's a number of factors for that. In terms of what you were talking about is uh, some of his play and some of his habits on the field, I think were, I should say, maybe exposed a little bit as the year went on. And I really started noticing this around week 4 against the Commanders. A lot of times he would fire out of his stance so low, which is great. You want low leverage and it helps him. But his head would be so far over his center of gravity that offensive linemen were able to just snatch him and throw him to the ground. And they would just kind of pop their feet back and let him fall to the ground. So that's something that he's going to need to get better with next offseason or next season. Another thing as well, he was a little bit undisciplined he's a rookie, but he was just a little bit undisciplined. Let me give you a couple examples. There was a play against the Dolphins where Nolan Smith ended up coming free, unblocked, and he ends up getting a sack. Jalen Carter is supposed to be crossing face to the other side of the center, but he ends up coming like he's going to cross face and then countering back to the other side. He leaves a giant alley for the quarterback to escape up through. Now, luckily, Nolan Smith came in so quickly that he was able to sack the quarterback before he was able to step up into it. But that's just an example of some of his undisciplined play. And there's a number of times on film where he loves, like, one of his go to moves is an inside counter. But the thing is, sometimes he doesn't win on that inside counter and he gets caught, but he keeps trying to continue his path inside. And then he gives up a huge lane for the quarterbacks to scramble up through. And so he just needs to fix some of that stuff where he recognizes, oh, my initial move didn't win. Maybe it's time to convert to power and collapse the pocket that way instead of taking myself out of the play. There's a number of times he would have fallen into a few more sacks if he maintained better rush lane integrity. So I think there's still room for him to grow. And of course, just being a little bit more polished with his techniques. There's some times where his hands get really wide when he's going to throw a club move. I think he can play with better hand carriage so that he's a little quicker with his strikes, prevents people from getting their hands into his chest as easily. But listen, even with some of those issues, he still had one of the best rookie seasons ever. He still had, I would consider, a top 10 season from an interior defensive lineman in terms of the pass rush game. I think you made a great point. He didn't play a ton of snaps, but he played a lot on third downs. He had the second most third down snaps of anyone on the team. He was fourth and first and second down snaps. So I think that's an area that we can hopefully see him make a bigger impact next year is in the run game.
Yeah. And I saw a lot of the same things that at times he was over eager, even starting his pass rush move at the start of the snap before he even has any forward movement. He's like starting some kind of cross chop move where he hasn't even closed the distance between him and the lineman yet. Um, so you can just see that he's like itching for sacks, which is fine. Interior pressure is one of the most valuable assets you could possibly have on defense. So much so that a lot of these run stoppers who, if you go back, 5-10 years, they would have been drafted near the top of the first round, and now those guys are going way lower. And then some of the guys who are developmental players but have interior pass rush potential are getting drafted higher than they typically would have been. And we're nitpicking some of the little things that we think he can improve, because he easily lived up to his draft stock. And there's no reason to see that won't continue to get better. And, he just has athletic gifts that a lot of guards will not be able to handle, period. So even if the bad habits stay, he'll still be effective. And so he only has room to grow from here. They brought in a new D-line coach, so maybe he can help hone some of those bad habits. I don't have much background on the guy. But yeah, overall, very excited and optimistic about him correcting some of those little ticky-tack things.
Yeah, and again, like you said, it's nitpicking, but these are things we want to see him improve upon because that'll just help him take his game to the next level and really be that true dominating factor on every down. Now we kind of brushed over a little bit his slowdown that happened during the season. I think a big factor of that part of it was, I would say a big part of it was actually the schedule. If you go back and look at his schedule to start the Eagles' schedule to start the season, they started the season with playing a lot of either bad interior offensive lines, a lot of teams that were dealing with injuries, or teams that had rookies starting either at center or at guard that he could take advantage of. For example, that I think even week one, the Patriots were down to their second and third string guards at both spots. They were down their two starters at both spots. Like you get to your fourth string guard, you're in a bad spot at that point in time. But there was a number of other games. The Buccaneers game, he played against a rookie and a backup center. I can't think of the other teams at the top of my head. But then you get to the later half of the season, you play the Cowboys. They had two All Pro guards, and not to mention the Cowboys don't give up a ton of sacks in general. They also played. They also played the Chiefs, who has an All Pro center and an All Pro guard, and then Trey Smith's a Pro Bowl level player as well. They played the Bills, who are a good team, and Josh Allen doesn't get sacked a lot. They played Pat Mahomes for what it's worth, doesn't get sacked a lot. Then they play the Cowboys again, who we've already talked about. You played the Niners. Like, these are good teams. Good teams don't get sacked a ton. So you just shouldn't expect the rookies to maintain that hot level of play against all pro caliber players, uh, versus the trash cans that they were playing earlier in the season. So that was one factor. I think the next factor, though, is I think he did hit a little bit of a maybe a conditioning or a snap share wall. I mean, you mentioned that they played a big rotation in Georgia. They had a big rotation where he didn't play a ton of snaps in Georgia. They were just so loaded that it made more sense to just keep rotating guys in and out and keep them fresh. And I think that played a factor. That was the most snaps he's ever played in his career last season. And I just think it was his first time experiencing that, and there were some slowdowns. I think that gives him another offseason to really go back and see, okay, what do I need to do to kind of condition myself to be prepared to play more downs? And I think that's an important thing to think about, because Vic Fangio mentioned in his recent press conference with the Eagles that conditioning is going to be a factor for Jalen Carter because they want to play him a ton of snaps. So let me look at, as we look to 2024 outlook, let me give you a few numbers. Fangio plays his top interior defensive linemen at a very high rate. Akeem Hicks and Christian Wilkins played 33% or greater of their snap shares every year they were with Fangio. Zach Sealer from the Dolphins played 33% of his snaps with the Dolphins as well. I know people are saying, okay, I don't know if this guy's actually a stud, but he ended up with 10 sacks last season. So I think Fangio saw that, he was one of his studs. If you're not one of the studs, you're a starter or a rotational player, they usually play about mid to low 20 to into the teens is their snap percentage share. So Jalen Carter played 22% of the snaps last season among the interior defensive linemen. He's probably looking at a 12 to 15% increase in his snap shares, which is, we're looking at probably 250 to 300 more snaps than he played this season. So conditioning is going to be a huge factor for him, and I'd like to see that improve going into next season. And we'll probably mainly see that increase on first and second down, because like I said, he was second on the team already in third down snaps. He was fourth in first and second down snaps. So hopefully he can improve in that area so we can see just more of his dominance down to down.
Yeah, and to be honest, it's something I'm a little concerned about. I watched several of the Dolphins games that were late in the season, and also they're like week one, where they played against the Chargers, I believe. And, it could be perception bias, but I thought I saw a lot more activity early on than I did late, and these guys are pushing 1,000 snaps. They had almost no rotation inside. And of course, that's true for any player, any team, that they're going to have more juice, less injuries in the beginning of the season as opposed to the end. But as you mentioned, Fangio almost takes that to the extreme where he's like, okay, these are my best guys. I don't care if they're tired, get in better condition. I'm going to keep them out there regardless. Or it just may be that he didn't like anyone else that he could have rotated in a little bit more. And that's something we'll talk about more, is the interior defensive line rotation, which I'm curious to hear your thoughts on.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a conversation that we'll probably save. We have a podcast, longer form podcast going in detail, more of that detail. So make sure to stay tuned to that, because we'll discuss that in depth. Now, just to discuss Carter, I think he's going to play that 30% plus of the snaps, for better, for worse. It just seems like Fangio knows that this is the best way for us to win, is to build our pass rush game plan around him. And I think he was asked at the press conference what the plan was for Jalen Carter, and he was a little coy about it. But I think I have some information that'll really excite some Eagles fans out there. So looking at last season, the Dolphins' interior defensive line had the most unblocked pressures of any interior defensive line that I looked at. And this was dating back to 2015, which was Fangio's first year as a defensive coordinator of the Chicago Bears. Um, their 39 unblocked pressures was 20 more than the second place team. Jalen Carter had one unblocked pressure last season. Everything he got was earned by beating guys one-on-one or beating double teams. Christian Wilkins had 20 unblocked pressures. Zach Sealer had 14. So it was their starting duo that really took got most of those unblocked pressures. This jumps Christian Wilkins' previous career high, and sacks was 4.5. Sealer was 3.5. Wilkins had 9 sacks this past season. Sealer had 10. Here's a crazy thing. Remember those real pressure rates I talked about where you take away how many pressures, you take away all the unblocked pressures from the total pressures that a player had? Wilkins was at 5.2% real pressure rate. Sealer was at 4.5%. Jalen Carter was at 11.8%. So not only did he doubled their real pressure rate where he's winning on his own, he's now coming into a situation where he's going to be playing a significantly higher amount of snaps than he did last season. And he's going to be getting a lot more easy, free, unblocked looks than he had this past season. If Christian Wilkins got 9 sacks last season, where the hell is Jalen Carter going to be at? This guy might legitimately push for 12 to 15 sacks next season if they can maintain that level of play. Now, just to discuss briefly how the Dolphins did this, it was almost exclusively running these nose tackle pick stunts where Sealer was essentially coming inside to pick the oftentimes was the center that was ended up double teaming on Wilkins, and then Wilkins would loop inside unblocked. And if Wilkins wasn't coming free, a lot of times Sealer was coming free because they didn't communicate the switch properly. So not only do I think this helps Carter, but I think whoever ends up as a number 2 pass rusher next to Carter is going to benefit greatly. So, and one last thing I'll leave you with is this. Just for shits and gigs, I looked it up. Jalen Carter plus 7,500 Defensive Player of the Year. Josh Sweat is at plus 7,500. Jalen Phillips is at plus 7,500. There's a huge, he's probably not going to win Defensive Player of the Year, but if a defensive tackle can get into that 12 to 15 sack range, guess what? They're in the conversation, and he is priced significantly higher than all these other players. I think there's just a huge mismatch on the market right now. There's not currently a Jalen Carter sack total for next season, but when it comes out, I bet you it's going to be too low, so pay attention to that. But I'm extremely excited for what Carter can bring going into 2024.
Yeah, the idea that him and Sweat's odds are the same is ludicrous. I think that is just hysterical. But I don't want to jump the gun because once we get into the edge rushers, I'll be sure to give my opinion on Sweat.
All right, well, we'll save that for another day. But today, I think we'll leave you with that high note for Jalen Carter, and check us out on the next episode as we discuss Jordan Davis.